to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Dr. Mark Plotkin. He is an amazing individual who's done a ton of work for the Amazon conservation and beyond. A direct student of Dr. Richard Evans Schultes in Harvard, and really influential figure in the psychedelic space. And I think you'll like this episode. We get into quite a bit of stuff. This was recorded kind of a few weeks into the COVID kind of lockdown, so maybe a little COVID heavy near the end, but very interesting nonetheless. He's got a new book coming out, and so definitely worth checking it all out. I'm really grateful for him joining us, and I think you'll dig it. So if you want to support the show, you can. There's a few ways. I think we've got maybe only 2 seats left for our July Navigating Psychedelics course. You can check that out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. If you want to learn more, it's an 8-week amazing immersive experience. And we've got time zones for folks in London, US East Coast, and people from Australia also join us pretty regularly. So, feel free to check it out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. If you want to support us with a small monthly donation, we'd love that. And you can support us for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/psychedelicstoday. That's a great way to help us out. We've also got shirts and mugs and all that kind of fun stuff up at psychedelicstodayshop.com. So, one more word from a sponsor, and we'll see you on the other side. This episode is brought to you by Mudwater. Mudwater is a coffee alternative with 4 medicinal mushrooms and adaptogens. With 1/7 the caffeine is a cup of coffee, you get sustainable energy without the anxiety and jitters of coffee. Kyle and I have had about 3 months worth of Mudwater, and we really like it a lot. Mudwater has really helped me slow down my coffee consumption, and I feel great after drinking it. Another thing I like about this company is that they donate a portion of each month's revenue to MAPS. Check them out at mudwater.com, mudwtr.com. Use the code psychedelic at checkout for 15% off. Hello, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Mark Plotkin, PhD, president and co-founder of the ACT, or Amazon Conservation Team. Mark, thanks for joining us again.
Good to be back, Joe.
Yeah, really excited to chat with you. It seems like it's been quite a bit since we've had you on last, and plenty has changed in Amazon conservation since then.
That's totally true, both for the better and the worse.
Right. Well, okay, that's good to know that there is a better.
There is a better, but there's certainly a worse.
Right. Good. So, last time we chatted, it was partly to talk about the, ESPD 50, the enthopotanical kind of volume that Dennis and Synergetic Press worked on. And I think that was maybe about 1.5 years, 2 years ago at this point.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think important to note is that you were a direct student of Richard Evans Schultes, famed anthropologist, ethnobotanist.
Yep.
And I think we got into that a little bit, but for those who don't understand, could you give us just a really quick high-level introduction to who he is?
Sure. Richard Evans Schultes, the Harvard ethnobotanist, was known widely as the father of ethnobotany. As a poor scholarship student at Harvard, he was sent off to study peyote amongst the Kiowa, and was so taken by his experience in that teepee that, as he said, he was lost to medical science forever, which actually is a bit of a Schultesian trickster pun. He then went on to do seminal research amongst the Mazatecs in southern Mexico, and was the guy who found the magic mushrooms. Now, as Schultes and any ethnobotanist will tell you, we didn't discover anything. The indigenous peoples taught it to us. Then his next foray, which lasted almost 14 years, was to the Amazon, where he discovered, and of course I say that again in quotation marks, ayahuasca. So he had almost a Zelig-like ability to appear where all these hallucinogens were being used. And, there had been scattered reports of all of these, but he was really the first scientist to not only go there, study it, take it, collect it. So he really played a seminal role in bringing indigenous wisdom and some of these entheogens to the attention of the Western world. And of course, the great irony for those of us who've had the honor and privilege to work with indigenous peoples is, why would you need a Harvard guy in a crew cut and a white lab coat to validate these things that the indigenous peoples knew and used long before he ever got there? But the fact is, he did. And to those of us psychonauts, I think that that's part of our mission, which is to validate and bring to the outside world's attention the importance of these plants, the importance of these fungi, the importance of these amphibians, and what great potential they hold for all of us.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, he's certainly an influential person and produced a lot of great students under him, not to mention his work.
Yeah, and I think that really, in fairness to his legacy, it wasn't just the people who had the great advantage of studying directly under him, like
Mm.
I did, like Andrew Weil did, but really his effect on many, many other people at Harvard and elsewhere around the world, because he spent a lot of time traveling and lecturing. And I fell under a spell in a night school course. And then I said, "You're like a famous guy, you've got tenure. What are you doing teaching in the night school for a few bucks and having to drive home at night in the snow?" He said, "Because not everybody had the advantage of a Harvard education. And part of my mission is to give back and bring what I know to a broader audience," which I thought was really a measure of the magnificence of his incredibly generous and, in a sense, shamanic vision.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. Really democratizing the knowledge is really helpful. And yeah, I hope to see more people try to do that kind of thing. So, on another track, ACT, your organization, has done a tremendous amount to conserve the Amazon, give ownership, clear. I don't know exactly how you phrase this, but help indigenous folks actually protect their own land from the government and logging and mining interests by helping them kind of stake out their boundaries using GIS systems. Is that kind of the long and short, or how do you like to talk about the mission and work of ACT?
It's a complicated mission, and you really nailed it. I mean, our job is to partner with indigenous peoples and local colleagues, academics, governments, or whatever, to protect these lands and these cultures. And when we set up the Amazon Conservation Team about 25 years ago, the idea was that you had groups like the World Wildlife Fund, where I've been working, that was focused on protecting rainforests, and you had groups like Cultural Survival, that was focused on protecting indigenous culture, but they really didn't talk to each other. And so we wanted to help create a discipline now known as biocultural conservation, because those of us who work with indigenous cultures, whether it's in the far north of Canada or whether it's in the Amazon, know that there's an inextricable link between traditional shamanic cultures and their environment. And nobody was addressing that. So, when you work with indigenous cultures, when you work with pre-literate cultures, the challenge is, how do you measure success? Because a lot of it involves sitting around the roundhouse, sitting around the maloka, sitting around the igloo, just talking, just telling stories, just listening, chewing the fat, literally. And donors want to know, well, what did you do with my money? Well, one of the approaches we take is what we call ethnographic mapping, training people to map and, in a sense, take control of their lands. And so here's the metric: 55 tribes, 80 million acres of ancestral lands, better mapped, better managed, better protected as a result of our work with our indigenous colleagues.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's amazing to see how much you've been able to protect. And if folks haven't listened, you got to really go back and listen to this interview we did with Dennis McKenna and Mark, I don't know, a year or two ago. And it was really extraordinary to hear how horrible some of the situations are in the Amazon, in particular, like Colombia on these cocaine trafficking routes and probably more. It's just extraordinary, the violence that exists.
Joe, the shamans often say everything is connected, which sounds sort of trite, and it's a butterfly effect. But here's proof of that, okay? This whole terrible pandemic, is due to our lack of respect for nature. It's due to wet markets, wildlife markets, where these poor animals are abused, stuck in these terrible concentration camp conditions, jammed together in their own filth, and they carry viruses. And the irony here is that many of these viruses don't affect them; they're healthy animals. But when you do this, these viruses jump out. And if you were thinking in evolutionary terms, do you really want to try and make a living off 10,000 penguins in the world, which are on the decline? Or does it make more sense to aim for humans, where it's 7 billion of them and increasing? So you have to understand evolution to understand why these things happen, to understand why SARS and MERS and COVID-19 weren't the end of the story. And as long as we keep abusing nature, we're going to pay a price. And here's how it ties back into the shamanic culture of the Amazon where I work. Because many of these things started in the old world. SARS and COVID-19 started in China. MERS started with camels in the Middle East. But I talked to Chris Walter when I wrote an editorial on the origin of all this and how it has to do with our fundamental abuse of nature. And he told me there's just as many viruses in the Amazon as there are in the forests of Central Africa, where AIDS came out of, as there are in the forests of Southeast Asia, where these coronaviruses came out of. So if you remember that old margarine commercial where it says, it's nice to fool Mother Nature. Well, more cynically, it's not nice to screw Mother Nature either, because, Mother Nature always wins.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking that, we can get away with this and make a few bucks or eat a few weird dishes and not pay the ultimate price is foolish. And, somebody said recently, the Earth's not in trouble. We're in trouble. The Earth's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
But it's us that's fouling our nest, that's abusing indigenous cultures, that's abusing forests, from the rainforest to the boreal forest to the far north. And Mother Nature is ultimately going to have her revenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And this thing will certainly last a lot longer, even if we're not here. So, well, until at least the sun swallows the earth, right? But that's going to be a while.
I did a book that never reached a wide audience, and it's called Medicine Quest. It was a sequel to my first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice. And I talked about the fact that viruses and bacteria have been here a lot longer than we have. And if you're looking at the story of antibiotics, what we were able to do was to take something that one fungus had created to keep a leg up on bacteria. So we had wandered in the middle of this microbial firefight that had been going on for millions of years, chose one of the weapons from one of them to use on the other, and thought we had conquered nature yet again. Well, you know what? This story predates us. This story will post-date us, and we have to figure how to survive in the middle of this firefight in the meantime.
Yeah, that's huge. And it's going to require a lot. I guess the Amazon's such an interesting place, right? Because it's mythic. It's in itself prolific. It's just such a powerful part of the earth. Like, you probably talk to people quite a bit about the Amazon generally or abstractly, but how do you like to pitch it?
Endlessly.
Right.
Look, I fell under the spell of Tarzan films. Johnny Weissmuller when I was a kid. I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark when it first came out. And part of the depth of those stories is the unknown, the green hell, the green cathedral, and everything in between. In this internet age, in the age of Google Earth, we kind of figure, well, what's left to discover? Well, 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to the rainforest of Honduras and find a lost city, a lost civilization. It wasn't Olmec, it wasn't Aztec, it wasn't Incan, it wasn't Egyptian. So these mysteries are still out there. And there's mysteries around the world. But the rainforests are probably the most mysterious, definitely the most mysterious of the terrestrial ecosystems. And there's much to be learned. And there's a great saying that many of my colleagues are sick of hearing me quote, and it comes from Suriname in the Northeast Amazon. And that is that the rainforest holds answers to questions we haven't even asked.
Yes.
So who knows if the answer to COVID-19 or SARS or the next virus, which is, coming at some point, is in the Amazon? And the answer is nobody knows, and nobody's really looking for it. So why not protect this treasure, steward it better, look for these answers, and keep the earth a rich and wonderful place. I don't want to live in a world with no rainforest. I don't want to live in a world with rainforests and no indigenous peoples. I don't want to live in a world with rainforests, indigenous peoples, and no shamans. It's all connected. So the great big news here for our colleagues tuning in is that since you and I talked a year and a half ago, Johns Hopkins University, one of the premier universities in the world, one of the premier medical schools in the world, has set up an institute of studies to focus on using entheogenic compounds from plants and fungi, and maybe even frogs at some point, to study and potentially cure so-called incurable diseases. That means PTSD, that means schizophrenia, that means insomnia, that means addiction. All of us who've experienced some of these otherworldly places, uses some of these otherworldly alkaloids or other compounds, are not surprised by this, but we're in the minority. Okay? We need to be in the majority. In other words, more people need to understand the power and the magic of these shamans and their plants and their fungi, and to respect that and to appreciate that and to utilize it in a way which doesn't wipe out the shamans and their forests in the meantime. And think about what else is out there. And let me give you a concrete example. When I did a TED Talk a couple of years ago, I talked about the magic frog of the Northwest Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and shared this talk in a village in the Northeast Amazon. And when I got to the green monkey frog, one of the shamans said to me, "Oh, we know that frog." And I said, "No, you don't." And he said, "Of course we do." And I said, "No, that frog's not here. It's in a country you've never heard of. It's 3,000 miles to the west. You've never been there. You never heard of it. No, you don't know it." And he said, "Yes, we do know it, and it's here." And I said, "No, I've been working here 30 years, and I've never seen it." He said, "That's because it lives in the canopy, and you're an ethnobotanist, and you don't go in the canopy." And I said, "Well, I've been here 30 years. Why didn't you ever tell me you had this frog?" And he said, "Well, you've been here 30 years, and you never asked me if we had this frog. I'm telling you it's here." And I said, "Okay, well, then how do you know it?" And he says, "Well, we use it for hunting magic," which of course is the original use of Campo amongst the Matses and other tribes in the Northwest Amazon, which floored me. And I said, "What else you got?" And he said, "Oh yeah, there's another frog that we know and we use for the same purpose." And I was able to find that frog, key it out. It's not related. It's not like, oh yes, one species over, so of course it has the same compounds. And I was able to do the chemical research of what's been done on that frog, and it does indeed contain bufotenin. And that indigenous person knew more than we did.
Right. And you're totally right about the connection. There's so many other plants and animals in the Amazon that we don't even know about yet, but certainly a lot of these tribes do.
And the race is on.
Yeah.
Protect the forest, protect the shamans, protect the frogs, protect the plants, protect the fungi, and let's learn what these people know before that knowledge disappears, because the knowledge is disappearing much faster than the forest itself.
I remember Paul Stamets saying something along the lines of biodiversity is national security or biosecurity. It's a really interesting kind of thing, but it makes sense. Like, we need a lot of these novel compounds that we didn't know nothing about.
Well, if you look at Tom Friedman in the New York Times, he's hardly a raging environmentalist, but he's been saying that all the troubles in the Middle East, one of the major contributing factors was climate change, drying up of desert areas where, life as a farmer is pretty marginal, which then sends these people to the cities, which are already overcrowded and there's no work. And then you have, civil wars that spill over to all borders. And here we are, wondering what caused this, what do we do, without realizing that there's going to be more of this. So yes, Stamets is right. Good environmental stewardship is environmental eco-security as well.
Yeah, that's tremendous. So I guess to talk about the negative side of what's happened recently, like, is there anything in particular on the Brazilian president I'm sure you have a lot of choice words, but anything you like to mention to people?
I have lots of choice words, but I will not share them with you because Brazil is a dangerous place these days. And I think you can read between my lips very easily and clearly. Look, let's not point our finger at Brazil as the enemy, the villain. There's a lot of great Brazilian conservationists and scientists. Conservation begins at home. And we have to worry about what we're doing here at home because, for better or worse, and I literally mean for better and worse, what happened to the Republican Party? The greatest environmental president in the history of this country was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican. The second greatest environmental president in this country was Richard Nixon, also a Republican.
Interesting.
And so when we start saying, Brazil is destroying the Amazon, Brazil's destroying the world, what are our policies here?
Right.
Okay. Pretty shameful and embarrassing. And I can say that openly because I'm an American citizen. So I do think that in the globalized world in which we live, we do need to not hesitate to point fingers at people doing the bad thing, but we also need to point fingers at ourselves when you look at the policies being enacted, when you look at the good policies being canceled. That sends a very bad signal to the rest of the world. And so when I see people doing bad things to the environment, it hurts me. And that's true of what happens to the US environment, that happens in the Amazonian environment, that means the Chinese environment, because in the old days, the Black Death, it took hundreds of years to move around the world. COVID took 4 months. That's the downside of the globalized world in which we live. So I don't want to let the Brazilians off the hook easily, but I also think it's important to realize that in this little rock in space, this third rock from the sun, we all have a responsibility to keep our own nest clean, and we also have a responsibility to call out people overseas. I remember towards the end of the Clinton administration where he wanted to create this new national park, and some of the people living nearby didn't want it. But who gets the ultimate say? Was it the people in that state? Well, I'm an American and I did want that park. Okay. When we had the Exxon Valdez disaster a couple of decades ago, I wanted to bring Brazilian environmentalists to Alaska to tell us to quit making a mess of the world. And so you have to be open-minded and willing to admit your own faults in terms of environmental protection and destruction. So yes, the Amazon is in trouble. Destruction is happening faster than ever. But I think the American election that's coming up is going to determine a lot in terms of U.S. policy and leadership and the lack thereof in the Amazon and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, we don't want to just freak out about international stuff. We have to say, okay, are we clean
exactly.
too?
We don't want to just freak out about it. We should freak out about it, but we should also freak about it what's happening at home as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And has there been any kind of backstepping in Colombia lately, or is Colombia doing okay in terms of the ACT projects?
Well, Joe, you asked about giving people title to their lands and protecting their lands. One of the things we've done very successfully at the Amazon Conservation Team is helping people gain title to their lands, which is ironic because they've been living there 10,000 years before we got here. And also, just in the last couple of months, ACT has partnered with the Supreme Court of Colombia to come up with a new policy which says that laws affecting indigenous peoples, indigenous lands have to be translated into their language, which sounds pretty obvious, but it wasn't done until we helped make this policy a reality. And, one of my frustrations in working the Amazon as long as I have is that people think the Amazon is Brazil.
Right.
And that's very, very partially true. Brazil is about 60% of the Amazon, a little more than that. The Colombian Amazon is bigger than New England because it's close to the Andes. Diversity is much higher in the Colombian Amazon, the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Peruvian Amazon than it is in Brazil because you have these changes in elevation. So, my recent book, The Amazon, What Everybody Needs to Know, was an attempt to lay out the case that, A, the Amazon matters to all of us, that deforestation contribute to changing rainfall patterns in the breadbasket of Brazil outside the Amazon. And even in the U.S. Midwest, there's some evidence that the climate is changing because of deforestation in the Amazon. So we can't have this attitude like, well, we got problems at home, and we got political problems at home, and we've got, poverty problems at home, all true. But these are global problems. They cannot be solved locally because their impact goes far beyond just the Amazon itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's enormous. It is a really huge thing. So does it stretch south of Peru at all? Or
yes.
Yeah.
The Amazon reaches its leafy tendrils into 9 different countries. And Brazil is the centerpiece, but as I said, it's only a part of it, about 2/3, maybe slightly less. And what many people don't know is the Amazon goes all the way to the Caribbean Atlantic coast in the Guianas, those 3 funny little countries north of Brazil. Guyana, which used to be British Guyana, which is where Jonestown was. Suriname, which used to be Dutch Guiana. And French Guiana, where Devil's Island was. So the Amazon is not just the Amazon basin. I make this point in my new book, that Amazonia, which is what we should be talking about, includes those 3 countries which are outside the Amazon basin, which includes much of Venezuela, which is outside the Amazon basin. And so the idea that the Amazon and the Amazon basin are similar and interchangeable is most assuredly incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
But the centerpiece of the entheogenic cultures is the northwest Amazon. One of the reasons Schultes decided to do his work there. That was the cradle of ayahuasca, certainly the northwest Amazon, and there's some debate amongst botanists and ethnobotanists as to how far south that was. Certainly it was in Peru. Seemingly it was in Bolivia. It most assuredly was not in the eastern Amazon in Brazil. But in the course of my own research, I found they were using entheogenic plants, or one entheogenic plant in the northeast Amazon, which is a Brunfelsia, a different species of the same genus, which was used in the western Amazon. So the puzzle is really incomplete in terms of the research that's needed to be done to figure out what the real situation was in 1491 before European civilization, so-called, swept in, demolished so many cultures and so many of these shamanic traditions, so many of these entheogenic traditions.
Yeah. So I guess historically speaking, when the West came in, do you think it was first like the Catholic, Jesuit priests that were documenting a lot of this stuff? Or were there other kind of early colonizers who were seeing these things in the Amazon?
Well, in addition to the book that I mentioned, I want to underscore the book that you mentioned, ESPD 50, which our friend Dennis McKenna organized a meeting and brought a lot of different experts together to talk about past, present, and future. And some of the best and earliest accounts are featured in that book, talking about missionaries' encounter with hallucinogens. And, there's a great quote from an anthropologist who was studying the Native American church. And he said, the white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus. The red man goes into his church and talks to Jesus.
Mm.
So these entheogenic compounds, which make the religious experience so much more real than much organized religion does, were actually threatened by these practices and these plants, because people didn't want to give up peyote and go to church and talk about Jesus, to put it in a very reductionist way. And so they were the ones who tried to stamp it out. And when you read what they did when they came into contact with the red bean in what's now the American Southwest, when they came into contact with peyote on the Mexico-Texas border, when they came into contact with ayahuasca in the Northwest Amazon, they want to get rid of it.
Mm.
They weren't interested in syncretism. They want to get rid of it. It's our way or the highway. And what we're seeing now is a much more syncretic approach, like the ayahuasca churches in Brazil, which have state recognition, and which is the way I think it should be. People should practice their own religion, or be free not to practice anybody's religion. But it's a decision individuals need to make for themselves.
Mm.
And the idea that fundamentalists have everywhere in the world is, I got the right way to the Godhead, and your way is wrong. Don't do it. Stop it. Or I'm not going to give you antibiotics. I'm going to chop your head off. So all of us who have a more open approach to spiritual belief, I think understand that. I think that's one of the great things that comes out of these out-of-body experiences, these hallucinogenic experiences, and acceptance of the way the world is, the way people believe. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this. I've certainly spent enough time with people who said ayahuasca is the way, and as soon as people like Putin and Trump and Bush take ayahuasca, the better off we'll be. Well, maybe that's true, but that should be optional, not mandatory in my belief system.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there. It if we even forced it on somebody, it could just make them worse. More of an egomaniac.
It's human nature. It's human nature, Joe. Any of us have kids know what happens when you try and force kids or anybody else to do something. The nature is pushback.
Mm.
And sometimes you have to get people to do the right thing or not do the wrong thing. Me and female circumcision, I'm not prepared to accept that as well. That's a cultural difference. I mean, to accept that, no, it's wrong and people shouldn't do it in my book. However, what we need is more respect for these other shamanic traditions. I do think we need to promote it in terms of saying this can help you deal with obesity, this can help you deal with addiction, this can help you deal with depression, but in a structured environment. I don't like these sort of rent-a-shaman approaches, like somebody went to Esalen for the weekend, and all of a sudden they're an ayahuasca shaman.
Sure.
We've all heard plenty of that. By the same token, I don't want to be an ethnobotanical snob and say, my guys are the best shamans, and anybody else is a BS shaman. That's too judgmental. But I do worry about all of us getting a black eye from people engaging in sacred ceremonies run by people who are really not trained and respectful of the indigenous tradition. So it's kind of a difficult line to walk in terms of getting it right and making it available, and not having to always have to hear about horror stories about somebody who went off to someplace and they took mushrooms, or they took ayahuasca and they had a bad experience, or they got ripped off, or they were sexually abused, because those stories are real in some cases.
Yeah, there's a lot of really terrible stories, and it's a really tricky thing to, as a Westerner, be able to comment on or caution against or anything like that, because it's I think an easy impulse to try to universalize on a lot of these critiques, when it really, we don't even know the percentage of original people doing, perhaps harmful things to clients. Like, we have no idea.
To me, there's a very odd but very apt analogy, and that's peace in the Middle East. When you talk to the people there, everybody knows what the outlines of a peace agreement would look like, but the hard part is enforcing it. The hard part is getting people to do the right thing. The hard part is to get people to drop preconceptions. So when we talk about shamanic traditions and entheogenic use and different therapies, we know how it can and should be done. But if it was easy, it would be done universally and done well. So this is why I'm so excited to see Johns Hopkins take a leading role. My buddy Tim Ferriss has played a role in promoting this in a responsible way. But, it's very frustrating for all of us who know and understand to some degree the power of these plants and the power of these shamans, to see how little is being done compared to the potential benefit of what could be done if we got it right. And like peace in the Middle East, it's the details that are very, very, very difficult, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Starting up a project with a number of other folks about kind of ethics and guidelines for, Westerners doing this stuff.
Exactly.
And we made a really strong point that we're really not going to comment on any real indigenous stuff as part of the project. There's plenty of other projects that might do that, but we just didn't really feel like it was right for us to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to my point about how difficult it is when you really get into the weeds, when you really get into the details. Who benefits and how? Should money be changing hands? How much should the shamans benefit? How much should the shamans' tribe benefit? How much should the national government benefit, if at all? I mean, if it was easy, it would have been done already.
Great. So I guess let's start talking a little bit about your book.
Yeah. So newest book, The Amazon: What Everybody Needs to Know, published by Oxford Press, was released in March of this year. It is available as a download on Nook and Kindle and iBooks, iPad, because so many people who need to read this are in the tropics, where it's hard to get access to books published in the U.S. And basically, it is an educated layperson's guide to the Amazon, and touches on everything from what is ayahuasca to what is a shaman to why should we care about the Amazon.
Yeah, that's enormous. And how long have you been working on it?
2 years.
Great.
My last book was on infectious diseases, the most unsuccessful book I've ever written for whatever reason. But, in the age of
maybe that'll turn around
COVID-19, it was a bit prescient. And the book focused on the deadly rise of drug-resistant bacteria. And the point that I made was, look, it doesn't matter whether or not you're a physician. If you understand evolution, you know that these bugs are after us. And that's true of drug-resistant bacteria. That's true of viruses. That's true of protozoans like malaria. So unfortunately, I was right that these bugs are after us. And if we defeat COVID-19, what about COVID-20? What about the next version of SARS? What about the next version of drug-resistant Staph aureus? So this has to be seen not as, World War II, where we have these people accept unconditional surrender on the battleship Missouri. It's more like when you're a kid, you're playing baseball and you would pass the bat back and forth and everybody put the hand all the way up to the end to see who batted first, because that's the way you succeed in a battle with microorganisms, which have been here a long time. And the way you succeed is keep a step ahead. That's everything from new antivirals, new antibiotics, maybe some of these plants the shamans have. It means you stay ahead by better hygiene. It means you stay ahead by enacting laws against abuse of wildlife. The best analogy here is that of the labors of Hercules when he had to battle the Hydra. And he said, okay, it's like a dragon. He cut off its head and two heads sprung up. Well, he realized it wasn't just going to be brawn that was going to be defeating this multi-headed menace. It had to be brains as well. So he cut off the head and burned it with fire. He burned off the next head, burned it with fire. And that to me is the analogy. That's how we stay ahead of microbial evolution. And of course, when you're dealing with an administration that doesn't believe in science or evolution, it makes it all that much harder.
Yeah. That is one of the current big deals. I'm, going through this COVID-19 crisis, I'm kind of scratching my head regularly saying, how are we going to become somewhat unified in the US again after this? Like, this seems to be breaking us up even more than anything else that happened in the Trump presidency. Like, why is it such a crisis?
Saving the Amazon might be easier than answering that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an easy cause to get behind, I think.
Yep.
Whereas, like unity in the US, it's like, good Lord. And the fact that people are science resistant is just unbelievable. Like, I don't really even know how to fight that other than start them young. And get them really excited about nature.
That's a longer term project.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this terrible crisis will be a way to take advantage of some healing and some camaraderie, and realizing that, whether you believe in evolution or not, we got to fight these things, and that's better done together than apart.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our audience, people are often, just really interested in one drug or a couple drugs or sacred compounds. And a thing that's been coming up for me lately is just how much diversity there is in the world of ayahuasca. Like, we want to think the essence is two plants, but, that's kind of true. But realistically, there's probably hundreds of different kinds of ayahuasca. Or what have you seen in your time down there?
Well, here's what's interesting. Ayahuasca, like much of Western science, is art and science. And these shamans, they all use the same two plants, but they'll put a little something in it. Or maybe they'll leave one of them out. Or maybe they'll prepare it a different way this time. Why is that? Maybe the plant wasn't available. Maybe it was in a different stage of its flowering cycle. Maybe it's because he was treating somebody who wanted to get pregnant and couldn't, and they really needed something else. So this is where this reductionist idea like ayahuasca, well, really, you could say it's just one plant, right? It kind of works on its own. But no, if you use two, it's much better. And it's not 2 times the power, it's 10 or 100 times the power. Plus, you have the lost ayahuasca. You have the one that Schultes found on the Rio Tiquié on the Brazil-Colombia border that nobody's ever found in use there. When people went back to look for it, the Indians said they didn't know it, didn't use it. Now, when an indigenous person tells you they don't know it, they don't use it, here's what it means. Nothing, maybe. It could mean they don't know it. It could mean they don't use it. It could mean none of your damn business. It could mean, how bad do you want to know? It could mean, I don't trust you and you got to stick around, and then I'll think about teaching you some of the stuff. So this diversity of plants and admixtures makes it infinitely fascinating. And Schultes himself wrote a paper where he said that, and the shaman said, well, if you use this part of the plant, you'll see jaguars. And if you use this part of the plant, you'll see anacondas. It's the same goddamn plant. I mean, not the same species, the same plant. And from a Western perspective, through the prism of Western science, that doesn't make any sense. But hey, he did it. And one place he saw jaguars and one place he saw anacondas. So how do they know this? How do they do this? And that's why this reductionist, where you can buy ayahuasca on the internet, it kind of misses much of the point.
Right. Absolutely. So so this is leads us to a complicated point. So getting back into the weeds a little bit. So a lot of us want to see a lot more access to this stuff in Western culture. Some don't.
Right,
Some really
right.
think that removing it from the Amazon, using it outside the Amazon isn't appropriate.
Yep,
And I don't totally know where I fit on that. Like if everybody in the US flies to the Amazon, like that's kind of a
right.
big problem. If there's a sustainable way to grow this stuff in Hawaii and not impact folks in the Amazon, perhaps that's more appropriate. I don't know.
Right.
Do you have any kind of thoughts on that? Like what's
I have
appropriate in
lots.
this?
I have lots of thoughts on it, and the
Good.
answer is there's no easy answer. If there was
Yeah.
an easy answer, we'd have it already.
Hmm.
The bottom line is you can't say, oh, you have to go to the Amazon and you can only deal with indigenous peoples, and they really need to be traditional, because that means that 99% of the world doesn't get to take advantage of this marvelous plant and its marvelous properties. But also, if you say, well, anybody who wants to buy it anywhere should be able to use it, and then when somebody inevitably dies, they think, well, if a pot of it's good, then 3 pots of it are better. That's another problem. So it seems to me that how ayahuasca should be available and used and served is a little like, I think, the medical office of the future. The medical office of the future, if we get it right, is going to have a physician, it's going to have a nutritionist, going to have a pet therapist, going to have a music therapist, going to have a dietitian, going to have a shaman, going to have a massage therapist, because there's no one person in one way that's going to embody all aspects of healing at the same time. And yes, you need to first and foremost respect indigenous traditions, indigenous peoples, and make sure that they are compensated for their knowledge, for their practice, for their wisdom, for their plants. But how do you do that in a fair way? I mean, if somebody lives in Rio de Janeiro and no longer speaks their tribal language, should they share in the benefits of what goes to the really traditional people who kept the tradition alive and braved the guns of land grabbing thugs to protect the plant and the tribe? And easy to ask, difficult to answer.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a horrifying prospect to have to dig into that.
Yep.
So it came up for me. One of our regular lines is you can't really clean a whole house with a broom. You need a number of other tools. And I really liked your analogy.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah, that clinic of the future with all those different folks, I think is really, really a great model. Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at medicine, say, look at all these things that are super effective or like are wildly effective for 20% of the people. It's like, okay, how do we find out better who you are? And that, it's quite the future development in medicine that we have ahead of us.
Agree.
Yeah. Okay. So what kind of stuff do you have coming up with ACT over the next year or two? Like I know COVID's probably shut you down a little bit, but beyond that.
Our job, very simply put, is to ride shotgun with our indigenous partners, give them advice, read the map, make suggestions, but ultimately they're driving the car and they have to make their own decisions. We can't make the decisions for them or tell them what to do. I mean, we can, but it doesn't work. And the whole COVID crisis was an example of why people need to be in charge of their own environmental and cultural destiny. And our job at ACT, our job as psychonauts, is to help these people be able to deal with the outside world on their own terms, whether that's the commercialization of ayahuasca, whether that's ecotourism, whether that's sharing their knowledge with the outside world for commercial pharmaceutical development, or telling people it's none of their damn business. That has to be their decision, but it has to be an informed decision. And so the COVID crisis really puts that to the stress test. Because if you're told that you cannot visit your indigenous partners and they can't come out of the jungle and visit you, and hey, the great news is all the shamans have WhatsApp. That's great. But how do you manage this relationship? How do you help these people when the isolation is indefinite? And how do you build self-reliance so the next time they get off from the outside world, they're better prepared? So in the old days, they didn't need the outside world. There was no outside world. Everybody hunted and fished and ate what they hunted and ate what they fished. Now that they've gone to the shotguns and they can't get shotgun shells.
Mm.
Does that mean they go hungry? Does that mean the old guys pick up the bow and arrow and show the young guys how to do it? One of the obvious answers, and we need to do a better job with food security and bring in crops from other tribal communities that they can grow to make sure there's no protein deficiency, to make sure that they're varying their diet, to make sure that they have new products that they can sell to generate more income, which doesn't involve cutting down the rainforest.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah, that's huge. That's really impressive too. The fact that people don't necessarily have food security, just probably for a lot of Westerners, doesn't make sense. But it's totally the case, and it has been the case for a really long time. Especially
Exactly.
once this trade thing and
Yep.
colonization has happened. It's certainly disrupted a lot. Great, and I'm kind of curious about these frogs or toads that you were mentioning earlier up in the canopy. So the toad that is the source of what's popularly known as combo,
Yep.
and you had a second toad or frog that you mentioned.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, can you speak about those two?
I was, yes, I was very good friends with Lauren McIntyre. Lauren McIntyre went to South America right after World War II. He was in the Navy and taught himself photography, attached himself to the U.S. Embassy, became the most famous photographer of the Amazon in the second half of the 20th century. If you've looked at pictures of the Amazon, you've admired his handiwork. In 1969, I think it was, I covered this in my new book. He made contact with a group called the Matzes on the Brazil-Peru border, who had not had any peaceable contact with the outside world. They certainly killed some outsiders who trespassed in his territory, and introduced him to the magic frog, the green monkey frog, known as Kembo. And McIntyre was so blown away, literally, that he never wrote this up because he thought people would think he was crazy. And a writer named Petru Popescu, a Romanian American, heard the story and he said, "This is such a great story. If you don't turn this into a book, I will," which he did. And another writer, Peter Gorman, who was the editor at the Times of High Times magazine, went and tried it and wrote it up for High Times. And this is really what brought it to the outside world. I have to say that Peter wrote a wonderful book called Ayahuasca in My Blood, which I highly recommend. And so this has become a thing. I mean, you can buy Kembo extracts on the internet, again, with all the positives and negatives that entails. So the idea that, hallucinogens were just plants, when Schultes was working with peyote, proved not to be the case. When he went south to Oaxaca and found out it was mushrooms, so it was fungi, and then went south and found it was plant because he found ayahuasca. And now we know that it's frogs as well. So to me, what that says is, why would we think that's the end of the story? There's obviously other mind-altering substances out there in the world. Maybe things that haven't been found by indigenous peoples. Maybe things in Africa or Asia that we haven't documented. Certainly, iboga from Africa is very promising as a treatment for addiction in scientific and medical circles. So I think we're just, what was that great phrase of Churchill's, we're at the end of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the end.
Absolutely.
Although we keep destroying these peoples and these forests, maybe it is the beginning of the end.
Right.
Hard to understand in history while it's happening.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah, it's probably enough to know that we're living in historic times, for sure. But staying aware of all these moving parts, and yeah, it's a tremendously troubling scenario. So regarding conservation efforts and in specific around psychedelic plants and animals, do you think we're doing okay right now? Do you think some areas are getting destroyed and other areas are okay? Or what are you observing?
When people say to me about the Amazon, is a glass half full or half empty? The fact is, any glass that's half full is half empty, right? And vice versa. So on the one hand, we're living in a world where ayahuasca and other entheogenic substances are coming to the fore and getting recognition by Western medicine, and people are being healed, and that's great. By the same token, the home of ayahuasca in the Northwest Amazon is being torn up by narcos, by road builders, and stuff like that. So we're really burning the candle at both ends. So if the question is the news good or bad, that's the wrong question, because the news is both good and bad.
Right. So I guess given the current pace of consumption of ayahuasca, like, does it make sense for Americans to use less for a little while? Or do you think we are burning it at both ends? So perhaps the answer is yes. Or,
Well, here's something that uh, many people don't realize. Ayahuasca is kind of a weed.
hmm
It really grows well in a lot of places. I mean, I've seen it grow wonderfully in Hawaii, for example.
hmm
So the idea that this is some sacred plant that you have to travel to the lost temple of the monkey god and get past the Indians with poison tipped arrows and the great stone rolling down near you, it's not true. The problem is when old growth ayahuasca is stripped out of old growth forests and the indigenous peoples themselves can't get enough of it. So we need to be much more respectful that way. There's enough deforested land in the Amazon to grow all the ayahuasca we'll need. And so, in your effort to try and do the right things or try and develop the right protocols, if I was starting a program to do the right thing, I would let's get these ex-Colombian guerrillas employed by growing ayahuasca, and so they're earning an income. They're not cutting down the forest. A piece of the action goes to the Indians. A piece of the action goes to the National Park Service. Let's make this a win-win situation.
Mm.
So the idea that, if you just drink 25% less, you're saving 25% of the Amazon, it's not that simplistic.
hmm
But I would say this. I mean, I would be respectful. I'd want to know where, we all go to the grocery and we want to buy organic stuff. How come nobody ever asked where the ayahuasca comes from? Was it harvested sustainably? Was it grown organically? You know how many times I've been asked that question? Never.
Right.
So these are the types of questions. Hey, if we're having raised consciousness, why the hell aren't we asking these questions?
Mm-hmm.
So my challenge to all of our like-minded colleagues is let's make sure we're getting this from a sustainable source. Let's make sure that it's being replanted when it's harvested. Let's make sure it's benefiting tribal communities or peasant communities that are respectful of nature and shamanic processes and things like that. Because I don't understand why anybody would go to the grocery store and want to get organic grapes, but will buy ayahuasca off the internet, not knowing or caring where it came from.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all the time. It's really unfortunate. I think a lot of this does come from prohibition. Like I think if we had substantially less prohibition here in the States, we could see more quote unquote fair trade markets for this stuff. But you're totally right. There's head shops all over the place on the internet just selling bulk ayahuasca supplies. It's crazy.
Joe, that's a brilliant analogy because during Prohibition, where a lot of people went blind because they're drinking bathtub gin without any control that there was the real thing. And when I buy herbs in a store, which I don't do very often, I'm always curious, who's the botanist here? Okay, how do I know I'm getting the right species of echinacea?
Mm-hmm. That's a really big deal. Yeah. And there's a lot of room for error there.
The room is your body. And I don't want any errors made. I think this is a little bit of a frustration of mine. People say, oh, well, plants, they can't hurt you. Like, really?
Yeah, right.
You ever taken strychnine? So same thing with these plants. And Michael Pollan made this very clear in his wonderful book, Changing Your Mind, where he said, that the physicians, and I know from my own experience, shamans will say, this stuff should not be taken by people who are mentally fragile because they can really come apart. And of course, some of the people that are going down to the Amazon and taking ayahuasca and these rental shaman camps are people with mental problems, mental issues, mental challenges. And so it's one thing if you got a sore knee and want to see if they can, pull the stress, pull the pain out of you. It's another thing if you've got schizophrenia or other deep emotional issues, which frankly sometimes can be released through shamanic practice. But the possibility of serious damage can happen as well.
Yeah, we try to suggest people figure out how to get a little stabilized first before digging in, likely working with a therapist or somebody else that's skilled in this area. Because if you're not stabilized, you can...
Good advice.
Yeah,
yes,
come even further apart.
And there's a real need, and I don't know if you guys, the people who do it, but I don't know who else do it. Who's a real shaman and who isn't? Who can you trust and who can you not? Seriously. I mean, when you go to a doctor, you don't have to wonder if you went to medical school, there's a damn diploma hanging on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
You go to a shaman, how do you know it's really a shaman? How do you know it's really an indigenous person? How do you know it's a traditional indigenous person? I mean, I know, but I've been doing this a long time. And I know I don't want to be perceived with people going, what about this shaman? What about that? It's not what I do. It's not what the Amazon Conservation does. We don't validate shamans or wannabe shamans or anything like that. But I challenge anybody who listens in or participates in these ceremonies. Let's find a way together to figure out who we should be celebrating and who we should not be recommending.
Yeah. On the Western end, there's a great website called psychedelicexperience.net where people will review their experiences. Kind of like a Yelp for psychedelics, for lack of a better term. And I don't know how far it goes into this indigenous world. And, perhaps that would be helpful.
Sounds great to me. I didn't know about it. Please give it the name again so other people can tune in.
Absolutely. Psychedelicexperience.net. A friend of the show, Tim Cools in Belgium, set that up. And it's got a lot of great data on there. And, you have to understand the limits of internet reviews as well. So it's kind of part of a game. It's not always something you can trust. But it's, perhaps that person does have skills beyond the normal skill set of standard primate. Magic looking stuff, perhaps, or just incredible plant knowledge that looks magical. All that stuff's really incredible. One friend actually got cured from, what's the autoimmune skin disease? Not shingles. It looks like a really weird patches of skin flaking off and it's really itchy.
Psoriasis?
That's it. Thank you. Yeah, he got cured.
Yeah. And we all have horror stories and we all have success stories.
It's amazing. Yeah, and nuance around the language too. So like you went to this ayahuasca retreat and you got cured. Was it the ayahuasca or was it the 30 other plant-based treatments they gave you? So it's,
or was it your own mind letting go of something bad?
Amen.
Or was it all of them?
Yeah, exactly. Autoimmune stuff is a really complicated ball of wax that could have a lot of origins in the psyche. So a lot of stuff to look at there. Totally. Cool, Mark. So I think we're about good. But are you in New Orleans right now?
I am not. I am in Arlington, Virginia, headquarters of the Amazon Conservation Team.
All right, cool. Is that home?
It's where I hang my hat. New Orleans is home, as is the Northeast Amazon. I commute.
That's a good commute.
Yes, but I pay taxes in Virginia, so that's the simple answer.
Right on. Got it. Cool. Great. So what's the name of your book again, Mark?
The new book is called The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press.
Great. And wherever books are sold?
Wherever books are sold, if they're sold at all. The easiest way to get a hold of it is to download it on iTunes or iBooks, iPad, Kindle, or Nook. But any bookstore should have it.
Outstanding. And what's the website for ACT?
We are at amazonteam.org.
Great.
And also, I set up a personal website, markplotkin.com, for other writings on entheogenic issues and ethnobotanical stuff, not necessarily having to do with the Amazon, like my analysis of the ethnobotany of warfare.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mark. Well, thank you very much for joining us again, and I really appreciate it. Hope we can do it again in the future.
Joe, a pleasure. Always nice to join forces with a kindred spirit.
And there you have it, Dr. Mark Plotkin. And I hope you liked it. Let us know what you think. You can email us at psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. Leave us a review on Facebook or whatever podcast app you use. That really helps us a ton. And if you want to have a conversation about it, you can join us over on our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/group/psychedelics today, or just Google Psychedelics Today group. We've got about 4,000 people up there, and it's always full of interesting conversations. So feel free to join up and have a conversation. Again, if you want to support us, patreon.com/psychedelics today for donating at least $2 a month. And it makes a big difference over here, I promise. So this is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today from Breckenridge, Colorado. See you next time. Bye-bye.